So, what does it take to make a stable society? A well functioning, a fluid, um, and inherently um, not fragile structure. Now, obviously, when we look at the world of different frames of reference, what sort of countries, what sort of states, what sort of societies do we have? Now, when you look at the kind of the easy metric, you look at what is the highest perceived, which is a subjective measure predominantly. What is the highest level of happiness out of all societies in the world? And I happen to be from the country that for 5 years running has been number one, which is Finland. And you might ask yourself, well, okay, what constitutes happiness in a certain society? And obviously, the Nordic countries are topping the list, anyways, with the addition of, for example, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, New Zealand, Australia. These are typically the countries where people are most satisfied living in, essentially. And then when you start to break down where does that originate from? For example, the Nordic countries are pretty cold. So climate wise, not a great place to live. If you wanted to get the perfect climate and where to live, you'd probably be looking, someplace like California or Okinawa in the south of Japan, or let's say the Mediterranean islands of Corsica or Sardinia. Now, climate wise, those are really good places to live. But the Nordic countries, not so much. But so why are people happy in these societies? There's several points which none of them can be missed if you want to propagate a society that is a well-oiled machine. Now, number one, you need to have constitutional guarantees of freedoms. That's very important. Number two, you have to provide a political system, a democracy, which essentially gives the people the power to voice their concerns and opinions. This is a dual issue. Number one, you have to give them the perception that they can make a difference, and number two, they have to be able to make a difference to a given extent. The perception in and of itself is very important because if people perceive that they don't have a voice, then there's no way to vent their frustrations or unhappiness of the state of affairs. And it also, when you have a free system and people have a voice and they can influence the outcomes of let's say, policy, then there's a social contract that people actually do trust and appreciate the state apparatus to a different level than in countries where you don't have a voice. And obviously then there's multiple layers that come on top of that, like corruption, like bad government, authoritarianism, nepotism, all of that stuff. But besides freedom and democracy, how do you keep the politicians from kind of overstepping their borders? You need to have a judiciary that is independent. So the politicians cannot influence what basically the courts are doing. So that's very important, number three. And then fourth, you absolutely need to have a functioning set of institutions. We're talking about public administration. We're talking about hospitals. We're talking about the military, the police, fire department. Um, Public officials need to be competent, and they also need to be, independent enough so they can do their jobs accordingly. And they should obviously be selected for their functions based on merit and not based on their last name or their connections or whatever else might constitute a somewhat dysfunctional society. And add on top of these four, you have to think about a central bank because governments take care of fiscal policy, and then you have to have a central bank that takes care of monetary policy. And just like the judiciary, the central bank needs to be independent. So the politicians cannot dictate what they're doing essentially. And then obviously on top of that, if you want to increase the level of happiness, you need to have a structure of social welfare which essentially means that those who are more skilled and more productive, they are taxed considerably more, both in relative and absolute terms. In absolute terms, that means that if you make a lot of money, even if you had the same tax percentage as somebody who makes less money, the tax percentage is the same. But if you make 100,000 instead of 50,000, obviously at 100,000 you pay the same tax percentage, you pay more taxes. And then relative terms, that's when you come to the very socialist phenomenon called progressive taxation. So if you make, let's say, 25,000 a year, maybe your tax percentage might be 10, 15, tops 20 overall tax rate. But when you make, let's say, 300,000, then you're in a position where you probably pay 40, 50% tax. And in the craziest taxing countries, just like the Nordic countries, you could be paying more than 50% of your income. So both in absolute and relative terms, you pay more tax. And this system essentially is then extracting resources from the top and distributing it to the bottom, to the people who are less able. I mean, able in terms of physically less able, and also here, they're just not capable of generating resources at the same level. And you actually provide a minimum level of subsistence for these people. So regardless of what lack of skills, lack of ability, or lack of work ethic they have, you still, as a state, you guarantee the minimum kind of quality of life, regardless. And that also applies to things like, let's say, healthcare. That you're not just going to let people, die on the street because they don't have money or insurance. And this is one of the weaknesses that you have in a country like the US, where the healthcare system per capita is more expensive, but the coverage is way lower. And obviously, you've got the interest of private corporations, big pharma, etc., that play a role. So it is somewhat of a dysfunctional system if you compare it to some of the European systems that are cheaper per capita, but the coverage is broader and the quality is also better. So having said that, being a poor person, it makes sense to live in Europe, especially in the northern European countries, because the welfare is at a relatively high level. But if you're wealthy, you're better off in the US, for example, because you pay less taxes in absolute and in relative terms. And then out of the net income that you get, then you can choose yourself where you want to spend it, whether it's healthcare, whether it's cars, investments, house, whatever. Now, why are people the happiest in the Nordic countries? And why the stability is equally there, which means financing the government is relatively cheap. I mean, obviously, US is the cheapest because that's kind of the benchmark. Then you've got countries like Germany, but then after Germany, you've got the Dutch, the Danish, Swedish, Norwegians, Finns, and the interest rates are very low. It is because the investors, they trust in the institutions of these countries. They trust the system, essentially, that they're going to pay back their debts. And well, this also is a sign of stability. Like, what sometimes people don't appreciate is the average wealthy person who's well off, they're pretty smart. Now, I'm not saying that you might have some people who inherited money or just, caught a crypto pump and they're complete dumbasses. And yeah, then you can say, oh, well, rich people are stupid. Sure, some of them are narcissistic, some of them are full of themselves, but the vast majority of wealthy people, they are not these high-flying athletes or celebrities or lottery winners or, guys who sold their companies and made a shit ton of money. These are quite regular people who just been in middle management. They might be smaller time entrepreneurs. They sell their company, they make a million or two. Or then there's regular guys that make 5,000 a month, and then they just save and invest. And through the decades, they built up assets. Then their assets might be at 2 million when they're 60 and retiring. But these are wealthy people per se. But these, on the average, they're quite smart. And if you don't appreciate, you understand the fact that if you are a wealthy person, you understand that there is a level of tax you should pay in order to maintain a safe and stable society. Instead of thinking, I want to pay less taxes, and as a result, I'm decreasing the safety and stability of the country I'm residing in. For example, in Finland, there's 7 recognized billionaires. there's 2 more that don't reside in the country but have the passport. But 9 people essentially who are billionaires. Almost nobody recognizes their faces. They could go to the subway, they could go to the train, and they would be fine. They would be safe. But that's not something you can do in South Africa, Colombia, India, perhaps even in the US, because you'd be scared of, being held for ransom, kidnapped, whatever, shot. So essentially, if you are wealthy enough, you understand on a certain level that you don't like paying taxes, but you understand that paying those taxes is better than the absolute alternative, which is that you pay less taxes. Personally, you make more money, but then you have to spend a lot more time and effort and energy worrying about your safety. You have to build walls around your house. You have to have security. You can't go outside. Your kids can't go out to play. And generally speaking, you're more worried about, am I going to get kidnapped? Am I this or that? So in that sense, there's an interesting statistics. Everybody knows the American dream, which is from rags to riches, right? And statistically speaking, this American dream is most likely to happen in Norway. Because when you have a wide coverage in terms of social security, you know that you're not going to fall to the bottom if you fail in your business endeavor. So you can take a bigger risk, and if you get a reward, sure, you get taxed plenty, but you're more likely to take the risk because if it fails, the system is going to cover you. You're not going to end up, sleeping, under the bridge, and you're just dead broke, and there's no healthcare, there's nothing. There's basically it's destitute. So in that sense, when the American dream of rags to riches most likely in Norway, and Norway has a similar system to other Nordic countries, these are good countries to live in. If you're wealthier, great, you're safe. Yeah, you pay taxes, that's kind of a bummer, but hey, you get something in return at least. If you're poor, the system is covering you. Now, where's the level of, balance? How much of government involvement should you have, and how much should the government stick to its core functions? Now, that's why you've got elections. I personally think the tax rates are too high. Government is involved in way too many parts of life and society that they should just not be participating in. But we recently had elections where the swing was from the left to right. So people do have a sense that they have a voice, and the system is changing according to the concerns of people. Now, obviously, when you look at the American dream nowadays, from making it from rags to billionaire, yeah, clearly it's the US, which is number one globally. If you want to make it from rags to billionaire, essentially. But then the one caveat here as well is one of the previous videos I touched upon IQ is unless you have a very high IQ and you have a high level of conscientiousness besides other attributes, you're not going to make it as a billionaire. No. But the great thing about the US is if you do have those talents and those skills, then you have a great business idea. The country and the market is so big, you can scale up that business. And that's what enables you to become a billionaire. Most other billionaires from other countries, it's either through some sort of corruption, nepotism, inheritance, or your second, third, fourth generation. You inherited the business. So right now, the wealthiest person in the world is a French guy who, he's inherited basically the business, and he's already pretty old, and he's been doing it for a while. But it's not the same thing as when you got Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or, Steve Jobs. These guys, or Larry Ellison, all of this, they kind of came up with themselves. They're not just like, oh, I inherited a ton of money. I mean, I'm not saying they weren't from, well-to-do backgrounds. Sure, they were. But the US system enabled them to actually make it that big. So becoming a billionaire in a country like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, it's possible, but it's not as easy as in the US. However, I think the social cohesion, which means also a level of trust that people have towards each other and towards towards the government and the municipalities. In these countries where also the corruption perceptions index is basically on top of the world, so people are less stressed on a, let's say, on a normal daily basis, because they know the system works, it's not corrupt, it's not trying to get them. You can trust the government officials, you can trust the police, you can trust the fire department, healthcare, etc. So that sort of quality of institutions is one thing. And yeah, even when you pay taxes, and these kind of unreasonably high taxes, you still know that there's only a relatively small proportion that's wasted in political programs propagated, yeah, generally by the left, or then from the right to their constituents. I mean, the left wants to give plenty of handouts to people who are less well off, and part of them is necessary to maintain a minimum level of subsistence for these people. But there's a bunch of them that are completely useless and not motivating and not enabling the people to work and generate more taxes. Whereas on the right side of it, there's a tendency of giving, let's say, subsidies to large corporations or tax breaks that might not be considered fair. So both sides have got their flaws, and but right now I think that the best way going forward, it's really to just cut back on, because look at the demographic in the West. The populations are aging. The public finances are in trouble. So you have to start, scaling back the government apparatus. You have to start scaling back the state. Otherwise, the money is gone. I look at the levels of debt. So it's just the solutions for this problem currently are coming from the right. The left is just saying, okay, let's put the blinders on, keep spending, and let's avoid the tough decisions, right? So, anyways, I started rambling here. It's been 17 minutes, but that's my thoughts on the 11th of April. Have a good one, guys.